the big fish of free agency for most people is Dalvin Cook. And I'm just going to start out by saying I'm a lot lower on him than most people are because he's going to be 28 when the season starts. And he has a nasty trajectory going on right now where he's lost zero point 0.3 yards per attempt in consecutive years now. He started out at 5 yards in 2020 and is down to 4.4 now in 2022. And the unfortunate side of it is the Vikings' run blocking offensive line has actually improved in that span according to PFF grades. So that's really pretty much on Dalvin Cook and Cook alone. He's also dropped 20 yards per game in consecutive years as well. He started at 111 in 2020 and is down to 69. So still a nice number in 2022, but still not as elite as it was in years past. So I'm a lot more tempered in my expectations for Cook, and I actually think he's better suited as being a really nice second option. And what I think makes sense for him then is you still want him, even though he's losing some athleticism, you still want him in an outside zone scheme because that's what he knows best, and he can still really perform nicely in that scheme, which is also a little curious then because the Vikings ran the most outside zone out of any team in the NFL last year, and they let him go. So I think that's another little bit of a cause for concern for him. But with all of that said, a place I'd like to see him end up is in Cincinnati because they run outside zone a good amount. And also, Cook wants a Super Bowl. Cincinnati is a top 5 team in this league. That gives you about as good of a chance as going anywhere will. And he's going to be kept fresh because Joe Mixon, still a really solid running back. He can be the lead back. But Cook can also give him a nice reprieve and make it that it doesn't just have to be Joe Mixon, which right now, I'm not somebody that really values running back, but right now it's Joe Mixon and complete unknowns at the running back position, which if you're a team that is as good as Cincinnati is, you want to minimize as many question marks as you can. And even though running back is probably the least important position that's not kicker or punter in the entire league, you want to make sure that you're going to be held back by as little as you possibly can. So I think Cook makes a ton of sense for Cincinnati. One good thing about Cook is that his yards per contact was actually increased from 2 seasons ago to last year. And he had the best or second best yards after contact of his entire career to this point. So he does have some things going for him. It's just, I would not rely on him to be the lead guy at this point. And I also just don't logistically see him in Miami. I know that he has that Florida connection, but the running back room in Miami is pretty well set. I don't really see how he takes away snaps from their younger guys that are just more athletically imposing than Cook is at this point. So I think Cincinnati would make a ton of sense. And I can't believe I'm saying this because just a couple of years ago, I would have said Zach Taylor is one of the worst coaches in the NFL. But I trust Zach Taylor a fair amount to get the most out of basically any player that plays for him, especially when it allows him to just run outside zone, which he wants to do anyways. So I think Dalvin Cook to Cincinnati would be a really nice addition for the Bengals if they don't have to break the bank on him. A solid offensive lineman that's still on the market is George Fant, who really struggled last year and was a bottom 5 offensive tackle according to PFF grade. But he, just the year before that, was really solid, and he's a really proficient pass protector when he's healthy, which was an issue last year. He wasn't healthy, in addition to constantly moving between left and right tackle, which is just kind of adding difficulty to somebody that's already struggling. And with that said, I think a good spot for him would be Miami because they really struggle with pass protection, and They specifically struggle at right tackle, which the one benefit to constantly moving between left and right tackle is the fact that you figure if you settle in at one position, you should be fine. And with that said, Austin Jackson was also a bottom five tackle for basically his entire career to this point. So it gives you multiple options. If Fant looks like he's back to form, he can be the starter. If Jackson looks like he's taken some big strides, he can be the starter. And it's not really a waste because if nothing else, Fant is going to be a really good swing tackle that could fill in for Armstead, who's injury prone, and could fill in for Jackson, who is far from a guarantee at this point. So I think it really makes a lot of sense. Fant also has really good mobility, so he would have a ton of success with the wide zone scheme of Miami, where you have to be really athletic to be an offensive lineman. So I think the landing spot makes a ton of sense. Shifting to corner now, the best defensive back still in free agency, in my opinion, is Marcus Peters, who is definitely getting up there in age at this point, but still has a fair bit to offer because in his past 3 years, he's averaged a 72 PFF grade, which would be good for 30th out of all corners. So he's been very solid for a while now, and he's really an interesting player because he's very aggressive and gambles a lot and can be burnt on double moves, but is a very nice player as a zone coverage guy, and he can force a ton of turnovers with his style of play. So I think a really good landing spot for him would be Jacksonville because they're going to be running more zone coverage with a defensive coordinator from Tampa that Tampa likes to run a fair amount of zone, so it's going to be safe to assume that Jacksonville is going to be running more zone this year than they did last year, and that will really allow for Peters to flourish. And in addition to that, the Jaguars were 9th worst in coverage according to PFF grade, so they definitely need help in their secondary. And Peters, it makes a lot of sense for him. Jacksonville is a contending team, and he could be the missing piece for their defense that really takes them to the next level. It also allows for Williams to move from the outside back to nickel corner, which would really help him because he's a lot better as a nickel corner. He has struggled a bit on the outside and has been really solid as an inside corner. So I think it really helps Jacksonville in a lot of ways. Moving to guard, Dalton Reisner is a really solid pass protector and somebody that struggles a bit as a run blocker. So I think a very logical landing spot for him would be Miami because they were 2nd worst in pass protection according to PFF grades, and they were top 10 in run blocking. So that makes a lot of sense to sort of balance out the offensive line in that way. And it also makes sense because Liam Eichenberg really struggled for the Dolphins at guard to the tune of being 75th out of 77 guards in PFF grading. And the year before that, his rookie year, wasn't much better as he was 80th out of 83 players at offensive tackle. So he has really struggled at both positions and really doesn't seem to have a place in this league so far. So it would make a ton of sense to bring in a legit starter in Dalton Reisner, especially while the window for the Dolphins to compete is wide open right now. Another good edge still on the market is Melvin Ingram, who was 54th in pressures, so he's still a solid edge rusher from that standpoint, but he's also a really foundationally good run defender as well, and that pairs really nicely with the fact that Seattle needs help with their pressure as a whole and with their edge run defense because they were 6th worst in pressure as a team, so Ingram can help there. And also, their run defense, as far as edge defenders goes, is pretty poor because Darrell Taylor was a guy that got a lot of reps as an edge rusher for them, and he's a really good third down rusher. That an underrated free agent is Daron Harmon, who is a safety that can really cover. He, in the past 3 years, has an average of a 65 grade for PFF, which would place him as about the 43rd best safety out of 94. So he's definitely above average, and he's really good in coverage. So a landing spot that I would like to see for him is in Jacksonville, because Jacksonville was bottom 10 in PFF coverage grade this past year, and they haven't done too much to address that. One big issue they still have is Rashawn Jenkins is a pretty poor coverage safety. He's all right as more of a box safety that can just focus on tackling at the line of scrimmage. But if you have to ask him to cover deep downfield, that becomes an issue. So Harmon would provide a different look for the Jaguars that I think would be really valuable, because at the end of the day, it's nice to be able to be a box safety, but what matters more is coverage. And that's especially true with Tampa Bay's influence on their defensive coordinating, as they got an assistant from Tampa Bay to be their new defensive coordinator in Jacksonville. They did have some box safety influence with Jordan Whitehead in years past, but they're going to be running a ton of blitzes, which means they're going to be putting a ton of pressure on their defensive backs to cover. So if you don't have somebody really smart like Harmon who can accommodate for the blitzing, it's really going to be problematic. And I think that's where Harmon really makes sense as an addition for the Jags. The second to last edge rusher on this list is Justin Houston, and he's pretty similar to Melvin Ingram in that Houston was 45th in pressures compared to Ingram's 54th, so they're pretty similar there. But Houston's a bit more enticing for me because he missed 3 games, so he would have been even higher on this list if he was healthy for the entire season. But Houston, like Ingram, is a really solid run defender as well, so he adds value there, which is especially needed for the Lions because they were 9th worst in run defense according to PFF, and he could play on early downs as an edge rusher, and if he's comfortable with it, on third downs, he could move to the interior and be an undersized defensive tackle, which is something that the Lions need as well, because Aleem McNeil is their only definitive defensive tackle that can get after the quarterback right now. So Houston would be a nice addition to Detroit for a variety of reasons. And if Houston isn't comfortable being that defensive tackle, Aiden Hutchinson also has potential there because he's 265 pounds. He's a little bit light to be that undersized defensive tackle on pass rushing situations, but he's not egregiously so. Last year's Josh Pascal was their rush defensive tackle, and he was 275 pounds, so it's not too much of a difference. Really, Pascal was not too much of anything last year, though, so if you limit his snaps with Houston getting some, that's, I think, a beneficial move for them in the short term, which is something the Lions have to be thinking about because they do have a shot at being a threat in the playoffs this year if they make it, which I think is pretty secure. They're in a weak division and a weak conference, and their team, on paper at least, has a lot of talent to it, so it makes sense to be a little bit short-sighted and go after Justin Houston. Other guy I would take a swing on is Dwayne Smoot, who was 50th among all 129 edges in pressures last year, and that's as he missed 2 games with, unfortunately, a torn Achilles, which is going to hold him back because he's going to miss a good bit of next season more than likely. But that means you can get him on the cheap and get him acquainted with your system and at least get a flyer more than likely on what he would look like moving forward for your team. So I think he's a good low risk, high reward type of player because he's been really solid in the past 2 years. And I don't see why that couldn't continue because the Achilles issue is a major one. It's definitely one of the most devastating injuries in all of sports, but we're getting better at handling injury mitigation. So I think that it's not a death sentence by any stretch, and PFF projects him to be signing about a $1.5 million contract, which I think if he were healthy, you're talking that's at least 5 times that amount. So he's definitely a low cost addition, and I think a place that would make a ton of sense for him is Atlanta because they're a young enough team and they're a bad enough team right now that they're not expected to win anything this upcoming year, but they are expected to start laying down the foundation really nicely to start winning in the near future. And the biggest issue for Atlanta still remains they don't have a good edge room. They added Bud Dupree, they added some other players as well that are definitely going to help with their edge room, but I would still say it's a pretty big weakness, and Smoot fits their type exactly. They have a defensive coordinator that comes from New Orleans, which historically likes big edge rushers that can really push the pocket and make the quarterback uncomfortable with not being able to step up in the pocket. And Smoot fits that build really nicely. He's really big at about 270 pounds, and he is pretty powerful as well. He's also got some pretty good mobility to him. He ran a sub 4.8 40, which again, he's 265. That's pretty good mobility for that size. So I think there's a ton of upside associated with Smoot. And really, again, if you're signing him for about $1.5 million, that's not too much of an investment at all.